The desert erupted in fire and thunder. Bullets tore through the Arizona night like angry hornets, tracer rounds painting streaks of death across the darkness. The command center screens flickered with a dozen different nightmare scenarios. Enemy forces breaching the perimeter, casualties, mounting defensive positions, crumbling under relentless assault. At the center of the chaos stood a woman. Her voice cut through the radio static with surgical precision. Squad Bravo shift fired to Sector 3. Delta covering positions now. Hawkins, I need that machine gun nest neutralized in 30 seconds. Staff Sergeant Marcus Calloway stared at her, sweat streaming down his face, his world tilting on its axis. This woman, this soldier he'd mocked just 3 days ago, was orchestrating a symphony of controlled violence that defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. Who are you? He whispered. She turned, green eyes blazing with an intensity that could melt steel. For just a moment, the professional mask slipped and he saw something deeper. Grief. Determination. A debt being paid in blood and fire. Then the moment shattered. Colonel Rachel Thorne, she said, voice steady as bedrock, and right now I'm the only thing standing between your soldiers and a massacre. The words hung in the smoke-filled air like a verdict. Dawn broke over Fort Redstone like a copper penny dropped in sand. The military outpost squatted in the high desert where Arizona bled into New Mexico, a collection of prefabricated buildings and concrete barriers that looked temporary but had endured for decades. The kind of place the Army built when it needed eyes on hostile territory but didn't want to admit it was hostile. Inside a nondescript building 300 miles away, Rachel Thorne sat alone in a windowless briefing room, staring at photographs that would haunt lesser souls. Her sister's face smiled up from the first image. Lieutenant Emma Thorne, 28 years old, bright-eyed and fierce, wearing her dress uniform at their parents' house last Christmas. The next photo showed a different Emma body bag being loaded onto a transport, a forward operating base burning in the background, the smoke visible from satellite imagery. 3 years. It had been 3 years since Emma's commander ignored her tactical warnings. 3 years since 14 soldiers died in an ambush that better leadership could have prevented. 3 years since Rachel received the folded flag and the hollow words about honor and sacrifice. 3 years of hunting. Colonel Thorne, she looked up. General Marcus Hartwick stood in the doorway, silver-haired and granite-faced, a man who'd spent 40 years making impossible decisions and living with the consequences. The transport leaves in 20 minutes, he said quietly. Last chance to abort this mission. Rachel's fingers traced Emma's photograph. No abort, sir. Strategic Operations Command doesn't typically send full colonels undercover as privates. Hartwick moved into the room, his footsteps deliberate. Especially not our best tactical minds. Intelligence confirms the same insurgent group is targeting Fort Redstone. Rachel's voice was steady, but her jaw tightened. The commander who killed my sister is already dead. I verified the kill 3 months ago. But his organization is still active, still planning attacks. And you think going in as a raw recruit will accomplish what exactly? It will let me see Fort Redstone's real defensive capabilities, not the sanitized reports, not what base commanders want me to see. Rachel stood, squaring her shoulders. I need to know if these soldiers are walking into the same trap that killed Emma. Hartwick studied her for a long moment. Timelines moved up. Intelligence intercepts indicate attack will come in 72 hours, not next week as previously assessed. Then I have 3 days to prepare them. Rachel, the general's tone softened a rarity that told her how seriously he took this. Your sister's death wasn't your fault. No, Rachel agreed, her green eyes hard as jade. But preventing the next one is my responsibility. 30 minutes later, she sat in the back of a military transport truck, wearing standard-issue fatigues that still smelled of the supply warehouse. Her service record had been scrubbed, replaced with a fiction Private Rachel Thorne, desk clerk from Fort Campbell, requesting transfer after a romantic relationship gone sour. The kind of mundane personal drama that made senior NCOs roll their eyes and stop asking questions. The truck jolted over rough terrain, and Rachel's tactical mind automatically cataloged everything she saw through the canvas opening. Approach routes, sight lines, defensive positions, the high ground to the east that would provide perfect overwatch for an attacking force. The dry riverbed to the south that could hide vehicle movements until they were dangerously close. Fort Redstone was vulnerable in at least a dozen different ways, and she hadn't even arrived yet. Her hand moved to the small photograph hidden in her breast pocket, Emma in her combat uniform, grinning like she'd just won a bet. Rachel whispered words only she could hear. I got Kozlov M. Put a bullet through his brain 3 months ago. But his people are still out there, and they're coming for this base. I won't let it be you all over again. I swear it. The truck rumbled through Fort Redstone's main gate past guard posts that Rachel's trained eye immediately identified as inadequately staffed. She committed the details to memory, building a mental map of vulnerabilities that would shame the base's defensive coordinator if he had any tactical sense at all. When the transport finally stopped, Rachel took a breath and became someone else. She slouched her shoulders slightly, let uncertainty creep into her posture, picked up her duffel bag with both hands instead of the one-handed toss that would betray years of military conditioning. By the time the driver opened the rear door, Private Rachel Thorne, nervous, inexperienced, slightly overwhelmed, was ready to meet the world. What she saw made her job both easier and harder. 7 men stood in a loose formation near the vehicle bay, watching her arrival with expressions ranging from amusement to barely concealed disdain. Their body language told her everything she needed to know about their unit cohesion. Strong bonds forged through shared hardship, but also the insularity that came from believing their way was the only way. The man at the center stood slightly forward, late 30s, sun-weathered, skinned shoulders that carried weight beyond his rank insignia. His eyes tracked her with the assessment of someone who'd learned to judge new personnel in seconds, cataloging strengths and weaknesses with practiced efficiency. Staff Sergeant Marcus Calloway. Rachel had memorized his file during the flight. 15 years in service, 4 deployments, decorated for valor in combat. Also the subject of an internal investigation 8 months ago after a patrol went wrong and 2 soldiers died. Investigation cleared him of direct responsibility, but the recommendation noted inflexibility in tactical decision-making and resistance to alternative strategic input. Translation. He'd ignored good advice and gotten people killed, not through malice but through the dangerous combination of experience and ego, just like Emma's commander. Another fresh face, one of the soldiers muttered loud enough to be heard. Corporal Daniel Hawkins' sniper PTSD diagnosis in his medical file that he'd successfully hidden from official review. His hands were steady on his rifle, but his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen things that wouldn't let him sleep. Rachel stepped down from the transport, letting her boots hit the dust with less precision than her muscle memory demanded. She scanned the faces watching her, committing each to memory while appearing merely nervous. Well, well, another soldier said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Tyler Barnes, tech specialist, 24 years old, brilliant with communication systems, but insecure about his relative youth and lack of combat experience. Betting this one doesn't last a week. Rachel's tactical assessment overlay ran automatically in her mind. Barnes' threat level minimal, but insecurity makes him potentially problematic. We'll need to manage his ego carefully. Hawkins, skilled but damaged, will respond to competence and respect. The youngest one, Connor Mitchell, watching with more curiosity than dismissal, natural ally, use him to build trust with others. And Calloway. Always Calloway. The key to everything. She met the staff sergeant's eyes, directly but not too directly. Confident enough to not seem weak, but not so confident as to challenge his authority. The calculation was instinctive after years of operating in hostile environments where the wrong look could mean death. Looking for Staff Sergeant Calloway, she said, letting just a hint of Kentucky accent into her voice. The personnel file listed her as being from Lexington, and Rachel had spent her teenage years there. The accent was real, just carefully suppressed during her career. Calloway stepped forward, chest slightly puffed. That'd be me. You must be our new addition. He looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. What's your name, soldier? Thorne, Rachel replied, offering nothing more. Just Thorne, Barnes interjected with a smirk. What, no first name, or are you one of those mysterious types? Rachel turned to look at him with an expression she'd practiced in the mirror that morning. Cool, unimpressed, just on the edge of insubordinate without crossing the line. She wanted them off balance, uncertain whether to dismiss her or take her seriously. Thorne works fine, she said simply. The other soldiers began gathering closer, drawn by the novelty of fresh meat to break in. Rachel tracked their movements peripherally while maintaining focus on Calloway. Infantry Tactics 101: always know where every potential threat is positioned, even when they think they're friendly. Connor Mitchell stepped forward, his baby face trying for worldly wisdom. Listen, Thorne, this isn't some cushy posting back in the world. Fort Redstone sees real action. The kind that separates people who can handle themselves from people who need babysitting. Rachel's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though it never reached her eyes. I'll manage. Will you now? Calloway crossed his arms, and Rachel recognized the body language. He was about to establish dominance, make sure this new soldier understood exactly where she stood in the pecking order. Tell me, Private Thorne, what's your background? Where did you serve before this assignment? Various postings, Rachel replied vaguely the way she'd planned. Nothing particularly interesting. She watched the frustration flicker across Calloway's face. Good. Vague answers would irritate him, make him focus on her attitude instead of her capabilities. By the time he realized she was more than she appeared, she'd have already identified every defensive weakness in Fort Redstone's perimeter. Various postings, Calloway repeated mockingly. The soldiers around him chuckled, pack behavior, establishing hierarchy through shared mockery. Well, aren't you mysterious? Let me guess you spent most of your time pushing papers at some comfortable base where the biggest danger was a paper cut. More laughter. Rachel let it wash over her, using the moment to continue her tactical assessment. The base layout was even worse than the aerial reconnaissance had suggested. Blind spots in the surveillance coverage. Communication arrays poorly positioned for backup redundancy. The motor pool visible from multiple elevated positions outside the perimeter. Emma had died because of mistakes like these. Rachel wouldn't let it happen again. Something like that, she agreed, which only increased their skepticism. Tyler Barnes couldn't resist adding his own commentary. I bet she's never seen real combat. Probably thinks this is going to be like training simulations. Oh, this should be entertaining, Hawkins said, though his tone was less cruel than resigned. Wait until she faces her first real patrol, 2 days tops before she's crying for a transfer somewhere safe. Rachel listened without reacting, her expression neutral. Inside, she was cataloging everything. The way Barnes needed validation from the group, how Hawkins used sarcasm to maintain distance from new people. Connor's relative silence suggesting he was the squad's conscience, uncomfortable with the hazing, but unwilling to challenge it. And Calloway watching her like a hawk watches prey, searching for any sign of weakness or superiority that would justify his preconceptions. Where did you complete your basic training? Connor asked, his tone more genuinely curious than mocking. The usual places, Rachel answered with the same calculated vagueness. Calloway's jaw tightened. Rachel could see him reaching the end of his patience, which was exactly what she wanted. Annoyed commanders made mistakes. They overlooked details. They stopped asking the right questions. Look, Thorne, Calloway said, his voice hardening. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but around here we work as a team. That means no secrets, no mystery acts, and definitely no attitudes. You're going to need to prove yourself just like everyone else did. I understand completely, Rachel replied, keeping her tone respectful, but not subservient. Good, because tomorrow morning you're going out on patrol with us. Calloway's eyes narrowed. We'll see exactly what kind of soldier you really are when the pressure's on. This isn't some safe training exercise where you get multiple chances to get things right. The other soldiers nodded in agreement, a Greek chorus of shared experience. Fort Redstone had a reputation for breaking new arrivals, and they all wore their survival like badges of honor. I'm looking forward to it, Rachel said, and for the first time her smile seemed genuine. The response caught Calloway slightly off guard. Most new soldiers showed at least some nervousness when confronted with the reality of Fort Redstone's reputation. This woman's confidence struck him as either profound ignorance or something he couldn't quite identify. We'll see about that, he said finally. Mitchell, show her to the barracks and get her settled. Make sure she understands the basic protocols and schedules. As Connor led Rachel away toward the living quarters, the remaining soldiers continued their discussion. Rachel's enhanced hearing, honed through years of operating in hostile territories, where missing a whispered warning could mean death, caught every word. There's something off about her, Hawkins observed quietly. She's too calm. New recruits are supposed to be nervous. Maybe she's just good at hiding it, Connor suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Or maybe she's one of those overconfident types who thinks military life is easy, Calloway concluded. Either way, tomorrow's patrol will show us exactly what we're dealing with. The frontier has a way of humbling people real quick. Rachel kept her expression neutral as she followed Connor into the barracks, but inside she was already 3 moves ahead. The patrol tomorrow would take them through sectors 7 through 12. She'd reviewed the standard routes during her flight briefing. Sector 9 was where intelligence suggested enemy activity, which meant Calloway would plan an approach that intersected with known patrol patterns, which also meant he'd be walking them into potential danger using predictable tactics. She'd have to find a way to redirect their route without revealing her expertise. A delicate balance, but Rachel had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this kind of tactical manipulation. The barracks were standard military efficiency rows of bunks, footlockers, minimal personal effects. Connor showed her to an empty bunk near the rear, explaining the daily routines with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this orientation a dozen times before. Chow's at 0600, he said. Formation at 0630. Calloway runs a tight ship, but he's fair if you pull your weight. Rachel nodded, setting her duffel bag down with careful deliberateness. She'd practiced the motion to appear less experienced than she was, two hands instead of one slight awkwardness in the positioning. Thanks, Mitchell, she said. I appreciate you not being a complete asshole about the new person thing. Connor smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his youthful face. Most of them aren't bad guys. They've just seen a lot of people come and go. Fort Redstone has a way of revealing what people are made of pretty quickly. I'm sure it does, Rachel agreed, and there was something in her tone that made Connor pause. For just a moment, he saw something in her eyes, a depth of experience that seemed at odds with her supposed background. But then she blinked, and the impression vanished, replaced by the uncertain expression of a transfer seeking to find her footing. Get some rest, Connor said. Tomorrow's patrol will be a long day. After he left, Rachel sat on her bunk and pulled out Emma's photograph, hidden beneath layers of regulation clothing in her duffel. Her sister's smile felt like both a blessing and an accusation. 72 hours, Rachel whispered to the image. That's all I have to prepare them, to fix the defensive gaps, to make sure your death meant something. Emma's photograph offered no answers, but Rachel didn't need answers. She needed action. She waited until the barracks settled into evening quiet, then slipped out with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years moving through enemy territory. Fort Redstone's layout was burned into her memory from aerial reconnaissance and satellite imagery, but nothing replaced boots-on-ground assessment. Rachel moved through shadows like she was born to them, which in a sense she had been. 15 years of military service, the last 6 in Strategic Operations Command. She'd planned defensive operations for forward bases across 3 continents. She'd coordinated counterinsurgency efforts that saved thousands of lives. She'd earned her rank through competence, sacrifice, and an almost supernatural ability to see 3 moves ahead in the lethal chess game of modern warfare. And right now, all of that expertise was focused on finding the cracks in Fort Redstone's armor before an enemy force exploited them. She found the first vulnerability within 10 minutes, a blind spot in the southern perimeter, where the surveillance camera's coverage didn't quite overlap. An attacker could move through that gap for nearly 15 seconds before being detected, which was more than enough time for a skilled infiltration team to breach the outer defense. Rachel photographed it with her phone, the device modified by Strategic Operations Command to appear like standard civilian technology while containing military-grade encryption. The second vulnerability was more concerning. The communication array's backup generator was positioned where a single mortar round could take out both primary and redundant power supplies simultaneously. Elementary mistake, the kind that came from peacetime thinking, where redundancy meant physical separation without considering coordinated attack patterns. By the time she returned to the barracks 2 hours later, Rachel had identified 14 critical defensive flaws. 14 different ways the coming attack could overwhelm Fort Redstone's defenses. 14 mistakes that would get good soldiers killed if she didn't find a way to fix them in the next 3 days. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling while the other soldiers slept. Somewhere out in the desert, enemy forces were positioning for their assault. The same organization that had killed Emma. Different commanders. Now Kozlov was dead by Rachel's hand 3 months ago, but the same brutal tactics. The same willingness to spend lives like currency to achieve their objectives. Rachel's hands clenched into fists. She'd spent 3 years hunting these people. 3 years turning Strategic Operations Command's resources toward vengeance disguised as operational necessity. She'd found Kozlov in a safe house in Ciudad Juarez, and she'd put a bullet through his brain while he slept, because Emma deserved better than she got, and someone had to balance the scales. But killing one man hadn't stopped the organization. It had barely slowed them down. So now she was here, undercover in a vulnerable base, trying to prevent the next massacre. Trying to make Emma's death mean something beyond grief and rage. Connor's breathing from the nearby bunk was steady, peaceful. Hawkins tossed and turned, his sleep troubled by whatever demons haunted him. Barnes snored quietly, oblivious. Young men who'd volunteered to serve, who deserved better leadership than they were getting. Rachel made a silent promise to all of them, and to Emma's memory, she would keep them alive. Whatever it took, whatever rules she had to bend or break, whatever secrets she had to keep, they would survive the next 72 hours, or she would die trying. Dawn arrived with the cruel brightness that defined desert mornings, 0 to blazing, in the span between darkness and day. No mercy given to those who valued sleep. Rachel was already awake and dressed when Connor came to wake her. She'd learned years ago how to function on minimal sleep, a skill honed through countless operations where alertness meant survival. She'd spent the hours before dawn reviewing everything she knew about the coming attack, building contingency plans within contingency plans. The mess hall buzzed with the subdued energy of soldiers preparing for patrol. Rachel filled her tray with standard breakfast fare, her movements deliberately less efficient than trained muscle memory demanded. Every gesture, every glance, every word had to maintain her cover as an inexperienced transfer. She sat alone, which was expected. New personnel always did until they proved themselves worthy of inclusion. Rachel used the isolation to observe cataloging the social dynamics that would matter when she needed these soldiers to trust her tactical judgment. Calloway ate with his squad, their conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. Good unit cohesion, but insular. They'd follow him into hell, which was admirable. But they'd also follow him into tactical mistakes without questioning his judgment, which was dangerous. Hawkins noticed her watching and raised his coffee cup in mock salute. Rachel returned the gesture with a slight smile, filing away his marginally less hostile attitude. The sniper would be crucial. His skills meant he saw details others missed. If she could earn his respect, he might become an ally. The briefing room was cramped, dominated by a large tactical display showing the topographical map of their patrol route. Calloway stood before it with the confidence of someone who'd planned dozens of these operations. "All right, people, listen up," he began, his voice carrying natural command authority. "Today's route takes us through sectors 7 through 12. Intelligence suggests possible enemy movement in Sector 9, so we'll be extra cautious there." Rachel studied the map with increasing concern. Calloway's planned route was textbook literally. She recognized it from the Army's field manual on patrol tactics, which meant anyone with basic military training could predict their approach vector. The path through Sector 9 used a valley approach that offered good concealment but created a natural choke point. Perfect ambush territory. She ran rapid calculations in her head. Enemy forces planning an attack on Fort Redstone would have scouts in the area. Those scouts would know standard patrol routes. If they were smart, and intelligence suggested they were very smart, they'd have observation posts watching for exactly this kind of predictable movement. Rachel's fingers itched to speak up to point out the tactical vulnerabilities in Calloway's plan. But revealing that level of expertise now would blow her cover before she'd achieved her primary mission objectives. "Questions?" Calloway asked, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Rachel with obvious expectation. She raised her hands slightly, keeping her posture non-threatening. "The approach to Sector 9 seems vulnerable. Would it be safer to take the elevated path through Sector 8 first, then approach from the north?" The room went silent. Multiple soldiers turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from surprise to irritation. Calloway's face darkened. "I've been planning patrols for 4 years, Private. I think I know what I'm doing. Your job is to follow orders, not second-guess experienced personnel." "Of course, Sergeant," Rachel replied, backing down with apparent meekness. But she'd made her point. She'd given him a chance to reconsider, which meant when things went wrong, and they would go wrong, she'd have established that she'd tried to warn him. Tyler Barnes leaned over to whisper loudly to Hawkins, "Here we go. New girl thinks she knows better than Calloway already." Rachel ignored the comment, but her mind was already racing through contingency plans. If Calloway's route led them into trouble, she'd need to be ready to act without revealing too much too quickly. A delicate balance, but she'd walked more dangerous tightropes. Within an hour, the patrol squad was moving out across the rough terrain. Rachel had been assigned to march in the middle of the formation's standard positioning for personnel requiring observation. She carried standard equipment and moved with carefully practiced competence that appeared adequate without being exceptional. "She keeps pace pretty well," Connor admitted quietly to Tyler as they navigated a particularly rocky slope. "Don't get too impressed," Tyler replied. "Moving across open ground is the easy part. Wait until we hit real trouble." Rachel heard every word but showed no reaction. Instead, she continued her tactical assessment of the terrain they were crossing. The satellite imagery had been accurate, but ground-level observation revealed details that aerial reconnaissance missed. Cover positions, sight lines. The way sound would carry in these valleys, making acoustic detection unreliable. As they approached Sector 9, tension increased noticeably throughout the squad. This area had seen several skirmishes in recent months, and everyone knew to expect potential contact with hostile forces. Calloway signaled for the squad to spread out and advance more cautiously. Rachel found herself thinking about Calloway's planned route. The more she saw of the actual terrain, the worse his tactical choice appeared. They were funneling into a natural kill zone, and he either didn't see it or didn't care, just like Emma's commander. The thought made Rachel's jaw tighten. History repeating itself because proud men couldn't admit they might be wrong. She'd come here to prevent another massacre, But if Calloway's stubbornness got these soldiers killed, Emma's death would have meant nothing. Suddenly, Hawkins on point position raised his fist in the signal for immediate halt. The squad instantly froze, taking cover behind available rocks and vegetation with practiced efficiency. Rachel's combat instincts surged to full alert even as she maintained her cover persona. She moved to concealment with adequate speed, careful not to reveal the automatic tactical positioning that years of training had burned into her muscle memory. "Contact," Hawkins whispered into his radio. "Multiple hostiles approximately 400 meters northeast." Calloway crawled forward to assess the situation himself, pulling out his binoculars. Through his magnified view, he could see at least 8 armed individuals moving through the valley below their position. They appeared to be conducting their own patrol or possibly setting up defensive positions. Rachel had maneuvered to a spot where she could observe the situation as well. She watched the hostile forces for several long seconds, her trained eyes catching details that others would miss. Their movement patterns, the way they positioned themselves, the equipment they carried, and something else, something that made her blood run cold. These weren't random insurgents. This was a coordinated team conducting reconnaissance for a larger operation. She could see it in their disciplined movements, their professional equipment handling the way they were mapping fields of fire for a defensive position. They were setting up an ambush. Not for Calloway's patrol, for someone else. Another patrol from Fort Redstone, probably following predictable routes just like Calloway's squad. "Sergeant," Rachel said quietly, crawling closer to where Calloway was observing. "They're not just patrolling. Look at how they're positioning themselves. They're setting up an ambush for someone else." Calloway glanced at her with irritation. "I can see what they're doing. That's why we're calling for backup instead of engaging. Too many of them for a direct confrontation. But if they're setting up an ambush, that means another patrol is walking into a trap," Rachel pressed, keeping her voice low but urgent. "Probably within the next 30 minutes based on their preparation timeline." The observation made Calloway pause. He'd been so focused on the immediate tactical situation that he hadn't considered the broader implications. But if this woman was right and her reasoning made uncomfortable sense, then another squad could be in serious danger. "Mitchell, check the patrol schedule," Calloway ordered. "See if anyone else is supposed to be in this area today." Connor quickly consulted his tactical display, his face paling as he read the information. "Delta Squad is scheduled to pass through Sector 11 in about 25 minutes. That would put them right in the path of this ambush." The situation had suddenly become much more complicated. Calloway couldn't simply wait for backup if friendly forces were about to walk into a trap, but they were outnumbered and in a potentially disadvantageous position. The textbook answer would be to radio Delta Squad and warn them off. "Options," Calloway said, looking at his team members. He was clearly struggling with the tactical problem, and Rachel could see the moment he started reaching for the obvious solution. "We could try to radio Delta Squad and warn them off," Connor suggested. "Radio traffic might be monitored," Tyler pointed out. "Could give away our position and Delta Squad's position simultaneously." Hawkins was studying the terrain through his scope. "We're too far out for effective engagement. Even if we had the high ground, the angles are wrong." Rachel had been analyzing the situation with 3 years of experience, hunting exactly this kind of enemy force. She'd identified their command element, noted the weakness in their left flank, positioning calculated firing angles and timing windows. "There's another option," she said carefully. "If we move to that ridge line there," she pointed to an elevated position about 300 meters to their west. "We could get effective firing angles. The approach uses that depression for concealment most of the way." Calloway looked at the position she'd indicated, then back at her with undisguised suspicion. "That's a dangerous movement across partially open ground. If they spot us, we'll be exposed." "There's a depression that runs most of the way," Rachel explained, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "Provides concealment for maybe 80% of the approach. The timing would be tight, but it's doable." "Numbers don't lie, Sergeant," Tyler interjected. "We're still outnumbered 2-1 even if we get the position." "Numbers aren't everything," Rachel replied quietly. "Position and timing matter more in this kind of engagement." There was something in her tone that made the other soldiers pause. She spoke with a confidence that usually came from experience, not from training manuals or theoretical knowledge. Calloway noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he reassessed this woman who'd arrived just yesterday. "You seem pretty certain about tactical assessments for someone with limited field experience," he observed suspiciously. Rachel met his gaze steadily. "Some things you learn quickly when your life depends on it." Before Calloway could respond, Connor grabbed his arm urgently. "Sergeant, Delta Squad just checked in on routine comms. They're 10 minutes out from the ambush zone. The moment of decision had arrived. Calloway looked at his squad members, seeing a mix of concern and determination in their faces. They would follow whatever order he gave, but he could sense their awareness that conventional options were rapidly disappearing. Rachel watched him wrestle with the decision, saw the moment his pride began to give way to pragmatism. He was a good soldier underneath the ego. He cared about his men, cared about Delta Squad. The question was whether he could swallow his suspicions long enough to trust a stranger's tactical judgment. "All right," Calloway said finally, and Rachel saw the decision cost him. "We moved to the ridge position." "Thorne," he fixed her with a hard stare. "Since this was your idea, you take point and show us this route you're so confident about." Rachel nodded and immediately began moving toward the depression she'd identified. The other soldiers followed, staying low and moving as quietly as possible across terrain that offered minimal concealment. As they began their approach, it became clear that Rachel had read the terrain accurately. The depression provided better concealment than any of them had initially realized, a natural feature that satellite imagery had suggested, but ground-level observation confirmed. Tyler whispered to Connor as they followed Rachel's lead, "She knows what she's doing." "Yeah," Connor replied quietly. "Question is, how does a desk clerk know terrain analysis like a ranger?" Rachel heard the exchange but didn't react. She was too focused on the movement, calculating each step, each moment of exposure, timing their progress to keep them concealed from the hostile forces below. Her training took over years of operating in hostile territory where one mistake meant death. Halfway to the ridge position, Rachel suddenly stopped and raised her fist in the signal for immediate halt. She'd spotted something the others had missed. One of the hostile forces had moved from the main group and was now positioned where he could potentially observe their movement route. She studied the situation for a few heartbeats, running calculations. The guard's position was elevated, giving him good visibility, but his attention seemed focused primarily on the valley where Delta Squad would be approaching, not on the slopes behind his position. Rachel gestured for Hawkins to move up beside her, keeping her movements minimal and quiet. "See the guard position at 2 o'clock. She whispered, her voice barely audible even at close range. "About 200 meters. Hawkins looked through his scope and spotted the lone hostile soldier. "Yeah, I see him. He's got a good view of our route. Can you take the shot from here?" Hawkins considered the angles, the distance, the slight breeze moving across the valley. "It's not an easy shot, and a miss would alert the entire enemy force to our presence." Rachel studied the situation more carefully, her tactical mind processing options faster than she could consciously articulate them. The guard needed to be neutralized, but a gunshot would compromise their approach, which meant close quarters, which meant exposing herself. "Wait here," she said simply. Before anyone could object, Rachel had slipped out of the depression and was moving across the terrain using cover that the others hadn't even noticed. Her movement was so smooth and silent that she seemed to disappear into the landscape itself, using every bit of available concealment, moving during moments when the guard was looking in other directions. "Where did she go?" Connor asked in amazement. Calloway watched through his binoculars, trying to track Rachel's progress. She was using fieldcraft that belonged in special operations training, not basic infantry preparation. Moving through dead zones in the guard's peripheral vision, timing her movements to avoid detection, reading the terrain like it was a familiar map. Within minutes, though, it felt like hours to the watching squad, they saw the guard's head snap back suddenly, then slump forward. Rachel had somehow reached his position and neutralized him without alerting the other hostile forces. She signaled back to the squad that the route was clear. "How did she do that?" Tyler asked in disbelief, his voice barely above a whisper. Calloway was wondering the same thing. That kind of infiltration required training that went far beyond anything a regular infantry soldier received. It was the kind of skill set you saw in Special Forces operators, intelligence field officers, people who lived in the shadows between conventional warfare and covert operations. "Who is she really?" he muttered to himself. The squad resumed their movement toward the ridge position now, with even greater respect for Rachel's capabilities. When they reached their intended position, they found that it offered exactly the advantages she'd predicted: clear lines of sight to the hostile ambush positions, while remaining concealed from enemy observation. Rachel immediately began identifying priority targets, her assessment rapid and professional. "Command element is in the center position near that cluster of rocks. Communications gear is positioned there." She pointed to specific locations. "If we neutralize those first, we can disrupt their coordination before they can call for reinforcements." Calloway found himself nodding along with her tactical assessment despite his earlier skepticism. Her identification of key targets showed battlefield analysis that typically came from significant combat experience, not theoretical training. Connor checked his tactical display with increasing urgency. Delta Squad is about 5 minutes out from the kill zone. The timing was perfect, but the execution would need to be flawless. They had one opportunity to prevent the ambush and protect their fellow soldiers. Failure would likely result in casualties for both Delta Squad and their own team. "On my mark," Calloway said, preparing to give the engagement order. His squad members took positions, checking their weapons and settling into firing stances. Rachel had already selected her targets and was adjusting her rifle accordingly. The other soldiers noticed that she handled her equipment with a familiarity that suggested extensive field use, not the hesitancy typically shown by personnel with limited combat experience. Hawkins, positioned next to her, whispered, "You've done this before. A lot." Rachel didn't respond, but her slight smile confirmed what he'd guessed. As Delta Squad's radio chatter indicated they were approaching the danger zone, Calloway realized that the next few seconds would determine whether they saved lives or witnessed a massacre. Everything depended on their ability to execute Rachel's tactical plan effectively. "Engage," he whispered into his radio, giving the final order. The coordinated fire from the ridge position was devastating and surgical. Rachel's shots were precise and methodical, taking out the command element and communications operator exactly as she'd planned. Hawkins and Connor focused on the flanking positions, while Tyler provided covering fire for any hostile personnel who tried to retreat. The entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. When the firing stopped, the ambush site was silent except for the distant sound of Delta Squad's approach, the patrol completely unaware of the danger they'd just been saved from. "Clear," Hawkins reported after scanning the area through his scope, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and awe. Calloway keyed his radio. "Delta Squad, this is Bravo Patrol. Sector 9 is secure. Hostile ambush position has been neutralized. Recommend you proceed with caution, but area is clear." There was a brief pause before Delta Squad's commander responded. "Copy that, Bravo Patrol. We didn't detect any threats on our approach. Thanks for the heads up." The words hung in the air. They hadn't detected threats because Rachel had seen what others missed and acted decisively to eliminate them. Calloway looked at his squad members, all of whom were staring at Rachel with expressions that had transformed from skepticism to something approaching reverence. Her tactical planning had been flawless, and her execution during the engagement had been that of a seasoned combat veteran, not a transfer with supposedly limited field experience. "Nice work, everyone," Calloway said, though his eyes remained focused on Rachel. "Let's secure the area and check for intelligence materials." As they moved down to examine the former ambush site, Rachel systematically checked each hostile position with professional efficiency that continued to betray her real level of training. She located maps, communication equipment, and documents that would likely provide valuable intelligence about enemy operations in the region. She was examining a tactical radio when Calloway approached her directly. "Thorne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of controlled frustration, "where exactly did you serve before this assignment?" Rachel looked up from the equipment, meeting his eyes with calm directness. "Various special operations units, nothing that would be familiar to most regular forces." The admission hung between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. "Special operations." Tyler had overheard his voice carrying a mixture of vindication and excitement. "That explains everything," Hawkins whistled softly. "Why didn't you mention this yesterday when we were giving you shit about being inexperienced?" Rachel shrugged, carefully gathering intelligence materials into her pack. "It didn't seem relevant at the time. Besides, some assignments aren't discussed openly for operational security reasons." Calloway was beginning to understand why Rachel had seemed so different from typical new arrivals. Special operations personnel often had extensive combat experience and specialized training that regular forces rarely encountered. Her calm confidence and tactical expertise now made much more sense, though it raised questions about why someone with her background had been assigned to Fort Redstone as a seemingly routine transfer. "How long were you in the Special Ops?" Connor asked, his curiosity genuine and without the skepticism that had marked their earlier interactions. "Long enough to learn a few things," Rachel replied without providing specific details. She had no intention of revealing her full background, yet maintaining some mystery would help her continue gathering information about Fort Redstone's defensive capabilities without constant scrutiny. As they completed their examination of the ambush site, it became clear they had prevented what could have been a significant attack. The hostile forces had been well-equipped and positioned to cause serious casualties to any patrol that entered their kill zone. "This intelligence is going to be valuable," Calloway observed, looking at the documents Rachel had collected. "Command will want to see this immediately." The patrol back to Fort Redstone took on a completely different atmosphere than their outbound journey. The squad members now looked at Rachel not as an untested newcomer, but as a proven team member who had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything they had expected. "I owe you an apology," Calloway said to Rachel as they walked. "I made assumptions about your background and capabilities that were clearly wrong." "No apology necessary," Rachel replied, maintaining her carefully constructed persona. Skepticism about new team members is healthy. It keeps everyone sharp and focused on proving their worth through actions rather than words. "Still, I should have listened to your tactical suggestions from the beginning," Calloway admitted. "Your route assessment was exactly right. We would have walked into a much more dangerous situation if we'd followed my original plan." Rachel nodded but didn't press the point. She'd achieved what she needed. Calloway now respected her tactical judgment enough to listen when she made suggestions. That respect would be crucial in the coming days when she needed to implement defensive improvements at Fort Redstone. When they arrived back at the base, news of their successful engagement had already reached the command structure through radio reports. Lieutenant Colonel James Bridgewater, the base commander, was waiting to debrief them personally, a level of attention that indicated the significance of their intelligence gathering. "Outstanding work out there," Bridgewater told the squad after the formal debrief concluded. "Your actions prevented what could have been a significant loss of personnel and equipment. The intelligence you recovered will help us understand enemy patterns of operation in this sector." During the debrief, Rachel's role in the success had become increasingly apparent. Her tactical planning, target identification, and execution had been the decisive factors in the engagement's favorable outcome. The other squad members had made sure Bridgewater understood her contributions, though they still believed she was simply a highly trained special operations soldier rather than the full colonel she actually was. "Private Thorne," Bridgewater said after the formal debrief concluded, his voice carefully neutral, "I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment." Calloway and the other squad members exchanged glances as Rachel followed Bridgewater to his office. They had begun to suspect that there might be more to her story than she had revealed, but the base commander's interest suggested layers of complexity they hadn't yet uncovered. In Bridgewater's office, with the door closed and audio countermeasures activated, the colonel's professional mask slipped slightly. "That was more risk than we discussed, Rachel," he said quietly, using her first name for the first time since her arrival. "The mission parameters changed when Delta Squad was threatened," Rachel replied. "I wasn't going to let another patrol walk into an ambush if I could prevent it." Bridgewater studied her for a long moment. "Your infiltration kill was captured on your helmet camera. That's Tier 1 operator-level fieldcraft. You nearly compromised your cover identity." "But I didn't," Rachel said firmly. "Calloway and his squad now believe I'm former special operations, which is close enough to the truth to be sustainable. They respect my tactical judgment, which is exactly what I need to implement defensive improvements before the main attack, which intelligence now confirms will occur in 48 hours. Bridgewater said, his expression grim. "The documents you recovered included enemy planning timelines. They're moving faster than we anticipated." Rachel felt her chest tighten. 48 hours. 2 days to fix Fort Redstone's defensive vulnerabilities and prepare for an assault by forces that had already demonstrated sophisticated tactical capabilities. "Then we don't have time for gradual trust building," Rachel said. "I need access to defensive planning immediately, tomorrow at the latest." "That will raise questions," Bridgewater warned. "Sergeant Calloway is already suspicious about your background. Giving us supposed private access to base defense planning will make him even more curious." "Let him be curious," Rachel replied. "What matters is keeping these soldiers alive. I'll deal with Calloway's suspicions when I need to. Right now, I need to assess Fort Redstone's defensive posture and identify critical improvements we can implement in 2 days." Bridgewater nodded slowly. "All right, I'll arrange for you to conduct a defensive assessment starting tomorrow morning. But Rachel, you're running out of time to maintain your cover. At some point very soon, you're going to have to reveal your actual rank and authority." "Not until I've completed my assessment," Rachel said firmly. "Once Calloway knows I'm a colonel, he'll defer to my authority instead of engaging critically with my tactical suggestions. I need his honest input, his squad's perspective. That only works if they think I'm close enough to their level to question." After leaving Bridgewater's office, Rachel returned to find Calloway and his squad in their usual gathering area, discussing the day's events with animated energy. The successful mission had bonded them in a way that routine patrols never did. They'd faced real danger and prevailed through teamwork and skill. "There she is," Connor said as Rachel approached, "the mysterious special operations soldier who saved our asses today." Rachel smiled slightly. It was a team effort. Hawkins made the initial contact identification. Calloway made the tactical decision to engage. Everyone executed their roles effectively. Don't be modest. Tyler said, his earlier resentment completely gone. That infiltration kill was something out of a movie, and your tactical planning was flawless. Hawkins was studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. You said you served in various special operations units. Which ones specifically? Rachel had prepared for this question. Most of my assignments are still classified. I can tell you I worked in counter-insurgency operations, tactical planning, and field coordination. But specific unit names and mission details aren't something I can discuss. It was a careful answer, truthful enough to satisfy basic curiosity, while vague enough to prevent detailed verification. The classification excuse would deter most inquiries since soldiers understood operational security requirements. Calloway watched her carefully. How does someone with your level of training end up requesting transfer to a frontier outpost like Fort Redstone? Most special operations personnel aim for high-profile assignments, not routine patrol duty. Sometimes people need a change of pace, Rachel replied, which was true in its own way. Constant special operations tempo can burn people out. Frontier duty offers different challenges without the same psychological intensity. Another careful half-truth. She had come to Fort Redstone for very specific reasons, but explaining those reasons would require revealing her connection to Emma's death and her years-long pursuit of the organization responsible. Well, whatever your reasons, we're glad you're here, Connor said sincerely. You saved Delta Squad today. That's not nothing. Rachel felt genuine warmth toward these soldiers who had accepted her so quickly after her demonstrated competence. They were good men doing difficult work in challenging circumstances. They deserved better leadership than Calloway's by-the-book approach had been providing, and they deserved to survive the coming attack. Get some rest, Calloway told his squad. After today's excitement, tomorrow will probably be all administrative work and intelligence debrief follow-ups. Enjoy the break while we can. Rachel nodded along with the others, but her mind was already racing ahead. Tomorrow she would begin her defensive assessment. She'd have perhaps 36 hours to identify critical improvements and implement changes before enemy forces arrived. 36 hours to make sure Fort Redstone didn't become another tragic repeat of Emma's death. 36 hours to honor her sister's memory by keeping these soldiers alive. As the squad dispersed for the evening, Rachel returned to her bunk and retrieved Emma's photograph one final time. Her sister's smile seemed both encouraging and challenging, a reminder of why this mission mattered beyond tactical considerations. Day one complete, Rachel whispered to the image. They're starting to trust me, starting to listen. 2 more days until the attack comes. 2 days to save them all. She slid the photograph back into its hiding place and lay back on her bunk, forcing her mind towards sleep, even as tactical calculations continued running in the background. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prepare Fort Redstone's defenses. But tonight, for just a few hours, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she'd accomplished. Delta Squad was safe because she'd been there, because she'd seen what others missed and acted decisively. Emma would have approved. In the darkness of the barracks, surrounded by sleeping soldiers who didn't yet know how much danger they faced, Colonel Rachel Thorne closed her eyes and dreamed of the sister she'd lost and the soldiers she was determined to save. The mission had truly begun. The desert night held secrets that daylight could never reveal. Rachel moved through Fort Redstone's shadows like smoke, her footsteps silent on concrete that still radiated the day's absorbed heat. It was 0200 hours, the dead zone, when human alertness dropped to its lowest point, when even trained sentries fought the biological imperative to sleep. Perfect timing for what she needed to do. The communications room sat in the base's administrative sector, a nondescript building that housed the encrypted satellite uplink to Strategic Operations Command. Rachel had memorized the security protocols during her pre-mission briefing, knew exactly which cameras covered which angles, understood the 6-second gap in surveillance coverage that occurred during the automated pan sequence. She slipped the that gap like water through fingers. Inside the communications room, banks of equipment hummed with electronic life. Rachel moved to the secured terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Encryption protocols engaged, biometric authentication accepted, and suddenly she was looking at General Hartwick's face on the screen, his silver hair slightly disheveled from being woken in the middle of his night. Colonel Thorne, he said quietly, his voice gravelly with interrupted sleep. Status report. Cover is holding but showing stress fractures, Rachel replied, keeping her voice low despite the room's soundproofing. Sergeant Calloway is suspicious after today's patrol engagement. Squad now believes I'm former special operations, which is sustainable, but limits operational flexibility. Hartwick's expression tightened. The engagement report crossed my desk 2 hours ago. That infiltration kill was exceptionally high risk. You nearly exposed yourself. Delta Squad would have walked into an ambush, Rachel said flatly. I couldn't let that happen, not when I had the skills to prevent it. Your mission is defensive preparation, not tactical intervention, Hartwick reminded her, though his tone carried more concern than criticism. We sent you there to assess Fort Redstone's vulnerabilities and prepare for the coming attack, not to play hero during routine patrols. Rachel's jaw tightened. There's nothing routine about soldiers walking into kill zones, sir. And the intelligence we recovered from that ambush site confirms what we already suspected. This organization has been planning the Fort Redstone attack for weeks. They have detailed reconnaissance, they know our patrol patterns, and they're coordinating resources for a major assault. Which brings me to why I'm calling at this ungodly hour. Hartwick said, his face grave. Signals intelligence intercepted enemy communications 90 minutes ago. The attack timeline has accelerated again. You now have 48 hours, not 72. The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. 48 hours. 2 days to fix defensive gaps that had accumulated over months of inadequate leadership. 2 days to prepare soldiers who didn't even know they were about to face the fight of their lives. I need authorization to begin defensive improvements immediately, Rachel said. Lieutenant Colonel Bridgewater is supportive, but he's constrained by maintaining my cover identity. If I'm going to implement necessary changes, I need operational flexibility. Meaning what exactly? Hartwick asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Meaning I need to reveal enough of my background to justify taking command of defensive preparations, Rachel said. Bridgewater has agreed to assign me defensive assessment responsibilities tomorrow. That will give me access to base infrastructure and tactical planning. But I'll need to show more expertise than a supposed special operations private should possess. Hartwick was silent for a long moment, weighing options with the experience of someone who'd spent decades making impossible decisions. Your primary mission remains intelligence gathering and defensive preparation. If revealing your actual rank becomes necessary to achieve those objectives, you have authorization to do so. But Rachel, his tone softened slightly. Once you reveal yourself, there's no walking it back. The operational flexibility of your cover identity will be gone. I understand, sir, Rachel replied, but keeping my cover identity isn't worth losing soldiers' lives. Emma died because her commander was too proud to listen to better tactical advice. I won't let that happen here. Your sister would be proud of what you're doing, Hartwick said quietly. But she'd also want you to be smart about it. Don't let grief drive you into unnecessary risks. Rachel felt the familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of Emma. 3 years hadn't dulled the pain, just taught her how to function despite it. This isn't about grief, sir. It's about preventing the next tragedy, about making sure these soldiers have the leadership they deserve. Then do what you need to do, Hartwick said. But Colonel, come home alive. That's an order. The screen went dark, leaving Rachel alone with her thoughts and the quiet hum of electronic equipment. She sat in the darkness for a moment, letting the weight of the mission settle more heavily on her shoulders. 48 hours. She hadn't heard the door open behind her, hadn't detected the presence in the hallway during her encrypted conversation. Years of training, thousands of hours of operational experience, and she'd missed the one detail that mattered most. Marcus Calloway stood in the corridor outside the communications room, his face a mask of shock and anger and dawning comprehension. He'd followed Rachel from the barracks, suspicious about her late-night movements, expecting to catch her maybe sending unauthorized communications or violating security protocols in some mundane way. He hadn't expected to hear her called Colonel. Rachel emerged from the communications room, her enhanced situational awareness finally registering the presence too late. She saw Calloway standing there, saw the expression on his face, and knew immediately that her carefully constructed cover had just developed a catastrophic crack. Colonel Calloway's voice was quiet but carried the force of betrayal. You're a fucking colonel. Rachel's mind raced through options, calculating responses. But she knew there was no easy way to navigate this moment. The truth was coming out just faster and messier than she'd planned. Sergeant Calloway, she began, keeping her voice calm and level. This isn't the time or place for this conversation. The hell it isn't, Calloway said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. They were still in a corridor where other soldiers might hear. You've been lying to me, to my squad, since you arrived. Playing some kind of game while He stopped, anger and confusion warring across his features. I wasn't playing a game, Rachel said firmly. I was doing my job, and right now my job is keeping you and everyone else on this base alive for the next 48 hours. 48 hours until what? Calloway demanded. Then comprehension dawned. The attack. You know about an attack. Rachel made a decision. She couldn't put this particular genie back in the bottle, and trying would only make things worse. Yes, intelligence indicates hostile forces will assault Fort Redstone within 2 days. Approximately 200 combatants, heavy weapons coordinated assault. The same organization that's been operating in this sector for the past 3 years. Calloway stared at her, processing information that reshaped everything he thought he understood. And you were sent here to, what, spy on us, evaluate our competence? I was sent here to save your lives, Rachel said quietly, to assess Fort Redstone's defensive capabilities and prepare for an attack that intelligence predicted weeks ago, to make sure what happened to other bases doesn't happen here. What happened to other bases? Calloway asked, something in his tone suggesting he already suspected the answer. Rachel's expression tightened, old pain surfacing, despite her attempts to contain it. 3 years ago, my sister, Lieutenant Emma Thorne, died in an attack by this same insurgent group. Her base commander ignored her tactical warnings because he thought he knew better. 14 soldiers died because pride trumped competence. The words hung between them like smoke from a battlefield. Calloway saw the grief in Rachel's eyes, the weight of personal loss driving professional mission, and something in his anger shifted. So you came here undercover to... He trailed off, still trying to make sense of the situation. To make sure history doesn't repeat itself, Rachel finished. To identify defensive vulnerabilities and fix them before the attack comes. To teach soldiers like you how to survive what's coming. She met his eyes directly. Your squad is good, Sergeant, but your defensive posture has gaps that will get people killed. I'm here to close those gaps. Calloway's jaw worked as he processed this information. And you couldn't just tell us this from the beginning, couldn't trust us with the truth. Would you have listened to me? Rachel challenged. If I'd shown up as a colonel from Strategic Operations Command, would you have treated me like a team member? Or like a superior officer to be deferred to? Would your squad have shown me their real capabilities, or would they have performed for inspection? The question hit home. Calloway knew exactly how his squad would have reacted to a visiting colonel, with professional courtesy and carefully managed impressions showing their best face while hiding their actual operational reality. I needed to see Fort Redstone as it really is, Rachel continued. Not the sanitized version you show visiting brass. I needed to understand your unit dynamics, your tactical thinking, your actual defensive capabilities. That only works if I'm close enough to your level to be included rather than briefed. Calloway understood the logic, but understanding didn't erase the feeling of betrayal. My soldiers trust me to keep them safe. How am I supposed to do that when I don't even know who I'm working with? You're working with someone who has spent 3 years preparing for exactly this situation, Rachel said. Someone who has the tactical expertise to maximize your chances of survival. Someone who cares enough about keeping soldiers alive that she spent the last 72 hours undercover, rather than pulling rank. She paused. The question isn't whether you can trust me, Sergeant. The question is whether you can work with me to save your squad. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications. Calloway had spent 15 years in service, had learned to read people in situations where lives depended on accurate assessment. What he saw in Rachel's eyes wasn't deception or manipulation. It was fierce determination and genuine care wrapped in professional competence. What do you need from me? He asked finally. Rachel felt relief flood through her, though she kept her expression controlled. Right now, I need you to go back to the barracks and get some sleep. Tomorrow morning, Bridgewater is assigning me to conduct a comprehensive defensive assessment. I'll need your squad's cooperation and your tactical input. After that, she paused. After that, we have 2 days to prepare Fort Redstone for the fight of its life. Calloway nodded slowly. And my squad, do they need to know? Not yet, Rachel said. Let them continue believing I'm former special operations. When the time comes to reveal my actual rank, I'll do it in a way that maintains unit cohesion. But right now, I need them focused on defensive preparations, not on processing chain of command revelations. Understood, Calloway said, though his tone carried reservations. But Colonel, when this is over, you and I are going to have a longer conversation about trust and honesty and what it means to lead soldiers. Agreed, Rachel replied. Now get some rest, Sergeant. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day. She watched him walk back toward the barracks, his posture carrying the weight of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally rearranged. Then she returned to her own bunk, knowing that sleep would be elusive but necessary. 48 hours until the attack. And now Calloway knew the truth, which changed the tactical equation in ways both helpful and complicated. Rachel lay in the darkness, listening to the steady breathing of sleeping soldiers, and let her mind work through the defensive problems she'd identified. Fort Redstone's southern perimeter, the communication array's vulnerable backup systems, the blind spots in surveillance coverage, the predictable patrol patterns that made ambushes easier to plan. 14 separate vulnerabilities, 48 hours to address as many as possible, and a staff sergeant who now knew she was a colonel, which would inevitably affect their professional dynamic. Emma's voice whispered in her memory advice from years ago during their shared training. Sometimes the mission gets messy, sis. Plans fall apart, covers get blown, nothing goes the way you expected. That's when you find out what you're really made of. Rachel touched the hidden photograph through her uniform. Wish you were here, Em. You always knew how to navigate these situations better than I did. But Emma wasn't here. She died 3 years ago in a base with inadequate defenses led by a commander too proud to listen. Rachel was here specifically to make sure history didn't repeat itself, regardless of how messy the mission became. Morning arrived with merciless brightness, dragging soldiers from sleep into the harsh reality of desert dawn. Rachel was already awake and dressed when the wake-up call sounded, her body long accustomed to functioning on minimal rest. The mess hall buzzed with morning energy as soldiers fueled up for the day ahead. Rachel filled her tray, noticing how Calloway watched her from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostility, but not the casual acceptance of yesterday either. Their midnight confrontation had changed things between them in ways that would take time to fully understand. She sat with Tyler and Connor, who greeted her with the easy camaraderie that came from shared danger survived. They still saw her as a fellow soldier with exceptional training, not as the colonel she actually was. Rachel felt a pang of guilt at the ongoing deception, but Calloway had agreed to maintain the fiction for now. Heard Bridgewater wants you for some special assignment today, Tyler said between bites of reconstituted eggs. Something about defensive assessments. Word travels fast, Rachel observed. Base this size, everything travels fast, Connor replied. Scuttlebutt says you're going to be evaluating our security posture. That true, Rachel nodded. Bridgewater thinks fresh eyes might catch things that have been overlooked. After yesterday's patrol, he figures I have enough tactical awareness to be useful. More than enough, Tyler said. That infiltration kill was the most professional combat action I've ever witnessed outside of training videos. If Bridgewater wants your assessment of our defenses, I'm guessing it'll be pretty valuable. Hawkins joined them, setting his tray down with the careful movements of someone whose body carried old injuries. Heard you're doing defensive review today, Thorne. You find anything interesting, let me know. I've been saying for months that our southern perimeter has blind spots, but nobody listens to the sniper with PTSD. There was bitter humor in his tone, but also genuine concern. Rachel filed away the information Hawkins had been trying to raise legitimate security concerns and being dismissed, probably because his medical history made leadership discount his tactical observations. I'll make sure to check the southern perimeter carefully, Rachel assured him. Any specific areas you're worried about? Hawkins pulled out his tactical tablet, calling up a map of Fort Redstone. Here, and here, he pointed to 3 locations. Camera coverage doesn't overlap properly. Someone who knows what they're doing could move through those gaps for 10 to 15 seconds before being detected. Doesn't sound like much, but for a skilled infiltration team, that's an eternity. Rachel studied the map, her tactical mind immediately recognizing what Hawkins had identified. He was absolutely right. Those gaps represented critical vulnerabilities that a coordinated enemy force could exploit. The fact that leadership had ignored his warnings suggested the kind of institutional complacency that got soldiers killed. I'll document these thoroughly, Rachel said. Make sure they're included in my assessment report with your observations credited. Hawkins looked surprised, then genuinely pleased. Appreciate that, Thorne. Nice to have someone actually listen instead of patting my head and telling me not to worry. The comment carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Rachel understood that Hawkins, like many soldiers dealing with combat stress, had been marginalized by leadership that saw his PTSD as a liability, rather than recognizing that his heightened threat awareness made him more tactically astute, not less. After breakfast, Rachel reported to Bridgewater's office for her official assignment briefing. Calloway was already there, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes carrying knowledge of truths that complicated everything. Private Thorne Bridgewater began maintaining the fiction for any potential observers. Based on your demonstrated tactical acumen during yesterday's patrol, I'm assigning you to conduct a comprehensive defensive assessment of Fort Redstone. You'll have access to all base infrastructure, security systems, and tactical planning documents. Sergeant Calloway will provide ground-level operational context. Understood, sir, Rachel replied. How extensive should this assessment be? Comprehensive, Bridgewater said meaningfully. I want to know every vulnerability, every gap, every potential improvement we could make to our defensive posture. Treat this as if we might face a significant hostile action in the near future. The careful wording conveyed multiple layers of meaning. To any casual listener, it sounded like standard security review. To Rachel and Calloway, it was authorization to prepare for the attack they knew was coming. I'll begin immediately, Rachel said. Should have preliminary findings by end-of-day comprehensive report by tomorrow morning. Excellent, Bridgewater replied. Dismissed. In the corridor outside Bridgewater's office, Calloway fell into step beside Rachel. So now we're working together officially, he said quietly. This should be interesting. I need your honest tactical input, Rachel told him. Not deference to rank, not military courtesy. I need you to challenge my assessments, point out things I might miss, provide ground truth perspective. Can you do that? Calloway considered the question seriously. You're asking me to forget you're a colonel and treat you like an equal. I'm asking you to treat me like someone who needs your expertise to save lives, Rachel corrected. Rank doesn't change the fact that you know this base and these soldiers better than I do. That knowledge is critical. Something in Calloway's expression shifted a recognition that Rachel meant what she said. All right, where do we start? Southern perimeter, Rachel said immediately. Hawkins identified surveillance gaps there. Let's verify his assessment and see what else we can find. They spent the next 8 hours systematically examining every inch of Fort Redstone's defensive infrastructure. Rachel moved through the base with the practiced eye of someone who'd designed defensive positions across multiple theaters of operation, identifying vulnerabilities with surgical precision. The southern perimeter was even worse than Hawkins had suggested. Not just surveillance gaps, but poorly positioned barriers that created natural channeling points for attackers. Guard towers that offered inadequate overlapping fields of fire. Defensive positions that could be suppressed by coordinated fire from elevated positions outside the base. How has nobody noticed these problems? Rachel asked as she documented the sixth major vulnerability in just the southern sector. Calloway's jaw tightened. Command focuses on patrol operations, not defensive posture. Fort Redstone hasn't faced a major attack in 3 years, so defensive concerns take lower priority than operational tempo. Rachel understood the institutional mindset. When threats seemed distant, preparations for those threats got deprioritized in favor of day-to-day operations. It was human nature, but it created exactly the kind of complacency that enabled catastrophic failures. These gaps need to be addressed immediately, she said, photographing the surveillance coverage map on her tablet. If hostile forces attack from the south using coordinated infiltration, they could breach our perimeter in under 2 minutes. Can we fix it in time? Calloway asked, and Rachel heard genuine concern in his voice. We can improve it, she replied. Perfect solutions take weeks. Adequate solutions can be implemented in days if we prioritize correctly. And they moved to the communication array next, where Rachel identified the vulnerabilities she'd spotted on her first night. Backup generators, positioned where a single mortar round could take out both primary and redundant power simultaneously. That's a catastrophic design flaw, Calloway said, staring at the generator setup with growing alarm. If we lose communications during an attack, coordination collapses, Rachel finished. Individual units fight in isolation. Defensive effectiveness drops by 50% or more, casualties mount exponentially. She documented the vulnerability with clinical precision, but inside she felt rising anger at the institutional failures that had created these problems. Fort Redstone wasn't uniquely bad. It represented systematic issues that plagued forward bases across multiple operational theaters. Commanders focused on offensive operations while neglecting defensive preparations. Equipment was positioned for convenience rather than tactical effectiveness. Surveillance systems were installed to meet checklist requirements rather than actual security needs. Emma had died because of mistakes like these. Rachel was determined to prevent repetition. By mid-afternoon, they'd identified 14 major vulnerabilities and countless minor issues. Rachel had documented everything with photographic evidence and detailed tactical analysis, building a comprehensive report that would either prompt immediate action or get buried in bureaucratic inertia. This is damning, Calloway said as he reviewed her preliminary findings. Command is going to hate this report. Command is going to implement these recommendations, Rachel replied with quiet steel in her voice. Because in approximately 40 hours, hostile forces are going to test every single one of these vulnerabilities. And if we haven't fixed them, good soldiers are going to die. Calloway looked at her sharply. 40 hours. The attack is confirmed for that specific timeline. Rachel realized she'd revealed information that supposedly only Bridgewater should know. Intelligence intercepts suggest a narrow window, she said carefully. Defensive improvements need to happen immediately, not eventually. They returned to Bridgewater's office. As evening approached, Rachel's tablet loaded with comprehensive documentation of Fort Redstone's defensive inadequacies. The base commander reviewed her findings with an expression that shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm as the scope of the problems became clear. "This is worse than I thought," Bridgewater said quietly. "Some of these vulnerabilities have existed for months. How did we miss them?" "Institutional focus on offensive operations," Rachel replied. "Complacency born from extended periods without major attacks. Inadequate defensive training among command staff." She paused. "Sir, with respect, Fort Redstone's defensive posture is barely adequate for routine security. Against a coordinated assault by the force we're expecting, these gaps will be catastrophic." Bridgewater's expression hardened. "Recommendations. Immediate implementation of priority improvements," Rachel said, pulling up her analysis on the office display screen. "Reposition surveillance cameras to eliminate blind spots. Move backup generators to separate protected locations. Reinforce southern perimeter with additional barriers and overlapping fields of fire. Adjust guard rotation schedules to account for threat windows. Establish redundant communication protocols in case primary systems are compromised." She continued through a list of 15 priority improvements, each one addressing critical vulnerabilities she'd identified. Calloway watched her present with something approaching awe. This was operational planning at a level he'd rarely witnessed, comprehensive and detailed and grounded in hard tactical reality. "Implementation timeline?" Bridgewater asked. 36 hours for priority improvements," Rachel replied. "Requires all available personnel working in shifts, but it's achievable if we start immediately." "Do it," Bridgewater ordered. "Sergeant Calloway, coordinate personnel assignments. Private Thorne, you have operational authority to direct defensive improvements as you see fit." The careful phrasing maintained Rachel's cover identity while giving her the authority she needed. But as Calloway and Rachel left the office to begin implementation, they both knew the fiction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. "Private Thorne giving orders to entire base personnel," Calloway said quietly as they walked. "That's going to raise questions." "Let it," Rachel replied. "What matters is getting these improvements completed before the attack comes. Questions about chain of command can wait until after we've kept everyone alive." They spent the next 12 hours in a blur of coordinated activity. Rachel directed teams of soldiers in repositioning equipment, reinforcing defenses, eliminating blind spots. She moved through the work with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dozens of times before. Her commands clear, and her tactical reasoning sound enough that even suspicious soldiers followed her directions. Tyler worked on communication systems, implementing the redundancy protocols Rachel specified. Connor coordinated barrier repositioning, his natural leadership emerging as he motivated soldiers through exhausting physical labor. Hawkins oversaw surveillance camera adjustments, his sniper's eye for angles and coverage proving invaluable. And Calloway orchestrated everything, his experience with Fort Redstone's personnel and procedures smoothing implementation of Rachel's designs. Despite his complicated feelings about her deception, he couldn't deny that her tactical expertise was transforming Fort Redstone's defensive capabilities. Around midnight, Rachel found herself alone with Hawkins on the southern perimeter, the sniper helping her verify that the new camera positions eliminated the blind spots he'd originally identified. "You're not just special operations, are you?" Hawkins said quietly, his tone more curious than accusatory. Rachel considered her response carefully. "Why do you say that?" "Because I've worked with special forces operators before," Hawkins replied. "They're good, don't get me wrong, but what you're doing here, this level of comprehensive defensive planning, this is command-level expertise, strategic thinking, the kind of thing you see from colonels who've spent years designing base defenses." He watched her face in the dim light, reading micro-expressions with the skill of someone trained to observe. "I'm right, aren't I? You're way more than you've been telling us." Rachel met his eyes directly. "What I am is someone trying to keep you and everyone else on this base alive. Does my rank or background matter more than that?" "No," Hawkins admitted, "but it matters for trust. I've followed officers into situations where they got people killed because they didn't know what they were doing. I need to know that's not what's happening here." The raw honesty in his voice touched something in Rachel. This man had been damaged by war, had seen things that scarred his psyche, and yet he still cared enough about his fellow soldiers to ask the hard questions. 3 years ago, my sister died in an attack on her forward base, Rachel said quietly. Lieutenant Emma Thorne, 28 years old, brilliant tactical mind, she warned her commander about defensive vulnerabilities. He ignored her because he thought he knew better. 14 soldiers died because pride trumped competence. Hawkins listened in silence, his expression understanding. I spent 3 years hunting the organization that killed her, Rachel continued. And when intelligence indicated they were planning an attack on Fort Redstone, I volunteered to come here undercover, to assess defenses, to prepare for the assault, to make sure what happened to Emma doesn't happen to you or anyone else here. So you do know there's an attack coming, Hawkins said. That's why you're pushing so hard on these improvements. Yes, Rachel confirmed. Approximately 36 hours from now, hostile forces will assault this base. Everything we're doing right now is about maximizing your chances of survival when that happens. Hawkins absorbed this information with the calm of someone who'd faced death enough times to stop fearing it. Does Calloway know? He knows, Rachel replied. Found out last night. We're working together now, but the rest of the squad still thinks I'm just former special operations. They deserve to know what's coming, Hawkins said. They will, Rachel assured him, when the time is right. Right now, I need them focused on defensive preparations, not on processing threat information. Fear doesn't make people more effective. It makes them sloppy. Hawkins nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I trust you. Whatever your real rank is, whatever you're hiding, you're doing this for the right reasons. That matters more than anything else. Thank you, Rachel said, and meant it. Now let's finish verifying these camera positions. We've got a lot more work to do before dawn. They worked through the night, and by morning Fort Redstone's defensive posture had been transformed. Not perfect, they didn't have time for perfect, but substantially improved. The blind spots were covered. The redundant systems were properly separated. The defensive positions had overlapping fields of fire. The communication arrays had backup power sources in protected locations. Rachel stood at the southern perimeter as dawn broke, surveying their work with satisfaction. 36 hours of preparation compressed into one exhausting push, soldiers working in coordinated shifts to implement improvements that might mean the difference between life and death. Calloway joined her, looking equally exhausted, but grimly satisfied. Never seen a base transform its defensive posture this quickly. Your tactical planning is impressive. Your implementation made it possible, Rachel replied. Good plans mean nothing without execution. Your soldiers worked their asses off to make this happen. They did, Calloway agreed, though they're starting to ask questions about who you really are. Tyler ran an analysis of your tactical recommendations. They match published defensive planning from Strategic Operations Command Doctrine. Connor noticed you have command presence that goes way beyond junior enlisted. Hawkins already figured out you're significantly more than you've been telling us. Rachel had known this moment was coming. Her cover identity had served its purpose. She'd seen Fort Redstone's real operational capability, identified its vulnerabilities, and implemented critical improvements. But maintaining the fiction was becoming counterproductive. How long until they need to know the truth, she asked. Given that we're apparently facing a major attack in about 30 hours, Calloway replied. I'd say they need to know pretty damn soon. They're going to be fighting for their lives. They deserve to know who's actually leading them. Rachel nodded slowly. He was right. The time for deception had passed. What came next would require trust, and trust required honesty. Tomorrow morning, she decided, after they've had a night's rest, before final defensive preparations begin, I'll gather everyone and tell them the truth. All of it, Calloway asked, including your actual rank. All of it, Rachel confirmed. They've earned that much. They stood together in the dawn light, watching Fort Redstone slowly come to life. Soldiers emerging from barracks guard shifts, changing the daily rhythm of military life, continuing despite the approaching storm. Colonel Thorne, Calloway said quietly, using her real rank for the first time in her presence. When this is over, assuming we all survive, I want you to know something. What's that, Sergeant? I'm glad you were here, he said simply. Whatever complications your deception created, you've done more to protect these soldiers in 3 days than our regular command structure has managed in 3 months. Emma would be proud of what you've accomplished in her memory. The words hit Rachel harder than she expected. She blinked back, sudden moisture in her eyes, maintaining composure through sheer force of will. Thank you, Marcus. That means more than you know. They returned to the base together, partners now in the truest sense. Tomorrow would bring revelations and preparations. The day after would bring fire and blood and the ultimate test of everything they'd built. But tonight, Rachel allowed herself a few hours of sleep, secure in the knowledge that Fort Redstone was as prepared as she could make it in the time available. She'd honored Emma's memory by ensuring these soldiers had better defenses than her sister had received. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. In her bunk, Rachel touched Emma's photograph one final time before sleeping. Tomorrow they learn the truth, Em. Then comes the fight. I've done everything I can to prepare them. Now we'll see if it's enough. She closed her eyes and dreamed of her sister's smile of soldiers, laughing together in mess halls of defensive positions that held against impossible odds. Dreams that felt like prayers, like promises made to the dead that the living would honor. 36 hours until the attack. 36 hours until everything Rachel had built would be tested in fire and blood. 36 hours until Fort Redstone would either stand or fall, based on the preparations of one undercover colonel who'd lost her sister to similar circumstances and refused to let history repeat itself. The mission was entering its final phase. And Colonel Rachel Thorne was ready. The storm came exactly 48 hours after Rachel's midnight conversation with General Hartwick. Dawn broke over Fort Redstone with deceptive tranquility, the kind of false calm that preceded catastrophic violence. Rachel stood in the command center surrounded by screens displaying a nightmare unfolding in real time. Dozens of vehicles approaching from multiple vectors. Heat signatures blooming across the desert like deadly flowers. Radio chatter in encrypted channels that intelligence was frantically working to decode. 200 hostile combatants, heavy weapons, coordinated assault patterns. The enemy's timing was precise professional military planning, not insurgent opportunism. The same organization that had killed Emma 3 years ago, coming to finish what they'd started at another unprepared base. Except Fort Redstone wasn't unprepared anymore. 30 minutes earlier, Calloway had gathered his squad in a quiet corner, his expression grim but resolute. "Listen up," he said quietly. "Thorne isn't a private. She's Colonel Rachel Thorne, Strategic Operations Command. She's been undercover assessing our defenses for the past 3 days. I've known for 12 hours kept it quiet because she needed to complete preparations without everyone treating her differently." Tyler's jaw dropped. "A colonel this whole time," Calloway confirmed. "Her sister died in an attack by this same enemy force 3 years ago. She volunteered to come here undercover to make sure we didn't suffer the same fate. And in about 30 minutes, she's going to coordinate our defense against 200 hostiles using expertise we desperately need." Hawkins nodded slowly, pieces clicking into place. That's why the infiltration kill was so clean. Why her tactical assessments were flawless. She's been doing this for years. "Questions can wait," Calloway said firmly. "Right now, we trust her expertise and follow her orders. She's earned that." "Clear." The squad nodded, processing the revelation even as alarms began sounding across the base. Now in the command center, Rachel's voice cut through the chaos with surgical precision. "All units, this is Colonel Thorne. Enemy forces approaching from vectors Alpha through Delta. 200-plus combatants, heavy weapons coordinated assault. Hold positions until they're in optimal engagement range. No one fires until I give the order." The words transmitted to every soldier on the base, her rank and identity revealed in the moment when it mattered most, when lives depended on absolute trust in her tactical coordination. She watched the displays with the intensity of a chess master, seeing 3 moves ahead. The hostile forces were using exactly the approach vectors she'd predicted during her assessment. They'd scouted Fort Redstone weeks ago, identified what they thought were vulnerabilities, planned their assault based on intelligence that was now catastrophically outdated. They expected to breach the southern perimeter through blind spots that no longer existed. They planned to suppress defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire that Rachel had completely rearranged. They intended to take out communications by hitting generators that had been moved to protected locations. Every plan they'd made was about to fail spectacularly. "Contact in 90 seconds, announced the tactical officer. Rachel's fingers moved across the command interface, highlighting priority targets for each defensive sector. Her voice remained eerily calm as she orchestrated the defense. "Squad Bravo, you have the eastern approach. Target their transport vehicles, first immobilize them before they can deploy infantry. Squad Delta Western Sector is yours. Wait for my mark, then concentrated fire on their heavy weapons positions. Hawkins, I need you on overwatch for their command element. Center vehicle second from the left in that rear cluster." In the northern tower, Hawkins acquired his target through the scope. "I have eyes on." "How do you know their armor configuration?" "Because I've been studying this organization for 3 years, Rachel replied, "and I know exactly how they operate." The first enemy vehicles crossed into optimal engagement range. Rachel watched the tactical display counting down in her head. Every second brought the hostile forces deeper into the kill zones she'd designed. All units, she said, absolute certainty in her voice. Engage on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. Fort Redstone erupted in coordinated violence that was beautiful in its precision. The defensive positions Rachel had spent 36 hours perfecting proved their worth instantly. Concentrated fire from overlapping fields caught the lead vehicles in crossfires that shredded armor and disabled engines. Infantry attempting to deploy found themselves exposed in positions where every angle offered defenders clear shots. The enemy's carefully planned assault ran straight into a defensive arrangement they hadn't anticipated and were completely unprepared to counter. Target their command vehicle now, Rachel ordered. Hawkins, take your shot. Hawkins exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. Through his scope, he saw the vision port shatter, the vehicle veering off course. Chaos rippling through the enemy formation as their command structure took a critical hit. Clean kill, he reported. Command vehicle disabled. Excellent, Rachel replied. All units maintain fire discipline. We immobilize their mobility and suppress their firepower before engaging ground forces. Calloway, positioned with Squad Bravo on the eastern perimeter, found himself following Rachel's orders with reluctant admiration. The deception still stung, but he couldn't deny her tactical coordination was saving lives. Every command made perfect sense. Every targeting priority maximized defensive effectiveness. Squad Bravo, shift fire to transport cluster at grid 821. Rachel's voice came through his earpiece. They're attempting to flank your position. Calloway directed his squad's fire to the indicated position. 3 vehicles loaded with infantry were trying to maneuver for a flanking approach. Concentrated fire from Squad Bravo caught them in the open, turning tactical maneuver into catastrophic mistake. How does she see these things before they develop? Tyler asked between bursts, his earlier shock giving way to professional appreciation. Because she's not just good, Connor replied, finally understanding. She's legendary. The first wave broke after 18 minutes. Vehicles burning heavy weapons positions destroyed infantry units, scattered and disorganized. The hostile forces fell back to regroup, leaving behind casualties that told the story of a plan gone catastrophically wrong. Rachel allowed herself 3 seconds of relief before refocusing. All units consolidate positions and reload. They'll adapt and return within 20 minutes. Use this time to prepare. She pulled up casualty reports, her heart clenching at the numbers. 8 wounded, 2 critical, but 0 killed. Against 200 attackers with heavy weapons, they'd survived the initial assault without losing a single soldier. Emma would have been proud. The enemy regrouped faster than expected, splitting into smaller, more mobile units. Distributed infiltration tactics designed to overwhelm coordination by creating multiple simultaneous threats. They're adapting, Rachel said, watching the hostile forces reorganize with professional speed, changing from massed assault to distributed infiltration. All squad leaders, you have autonomy to engage threats in your sectors without waiting for my authorization. Trust your training and communicate with adjacent units. I'll provide overwatch and coordinate between sectors. It was exactly what Emma would have done, trusting soldiers to make sound decisions rather than trying to micromanage from a command center. The second wave came as small teams of highly trained infantry infiltrating from multiple directions simultaneously, but Rachel had anticipated this adaptation. The defense in depth she'd implemented could respond to multiple threat types. Squad Bravo detected infiltrators attempting to breach the eastern perimeter. Calloway let them partially penetrate before triggering a counter-ambush that caught the enemy team in a deadly crossfire. Eastern sector infiltration team neutralized, he reported. No friendly casualties. Well executed, Sergeant, Rachel acknowledged. Connor's team in the southern sector caught infiltrators in the surveillance gaps that Hawkins had originally identified, gaps now covered by carefully positioned defensive positions. Southern sector multiple contacts suppressed, Connor reported. They walked right into our firing positions. Rachel allowed herself a tight smile. The improvements were working. Fort Redstone's defense was holding against forces that had expected to overwhelm inadequate defenses. Then tactical displays lit up with new threat indicators. Enemy forces massing for an assault on the communications tower, the position that, if disabled, would cripple coordinated defense. They're going for the tower, Rachel said, tension evident in her voice. If they take it down, we lose coordination. She made her decision instantly. I'm taking a team to reinforce the tower. Bridgewater, you have command. The Colonel, your place is here. My place is wherever I'm most needed, Rachel interrupted. And right now, that's defending the communications tower. She was already moving, grabbing weapons. Calloway intercepted her. If you're going, I'm coming, he said flatly. Don't argue. Tyler, Connor, you're with us, Rachel ordered. Hawkins maintained overwatch and provide cover fire. They moved through Fort Redstone toward the tower with coordinated precision. Rachel led them through routes she'd mapped during her assessment using cover positions she'd reinforced. Enemy fire intensified as they approached. Rachel's combat instincts took over completely, her body moving with muscle memory, built through countless operations. "Cover left," she ordered, dropping behind a barrier as automatic fire stitched the ground where she'd been standing. Tyler returned fire, suppressing the enemy position long enough for them to advance. They reached the tower to find the defensive team pinned down, 3 wounded, ammunition running low. "Colonel Thorne," the team leader said with obvious relief. "Didn't expect command to show up personally." "Change of plans?" Rachel replied, rapidly assessing the situation. "Connor, get the wounded to medical. Tyler, suppression fire on that heavy weapons position. Calloway, you and I are setting up a counter ambush." Isha, for 30 minutes, Rachel demonstrated why Strategic Operations Command had given her responsibility for defensive planning across multiple theaters. She repositioned defenders to create overlapping fields of fire. She identified weaknesses in the enemy's assault formation and exploited them mercilessly. She coordinated with Hawkins's Overwatch to create devastating crossfire. And she did it all while personally engaging targets with surgical precision that left her team in awe. "She's not just planning this defense," Tyler said, watching Rachel systematically eliminate enemy positions. "She's fighting it herself. That's what real leaders do." Calloway replied, his resentment finally giving way to genuine respect. "They don't ask soldiers to do anything they're not willing to do themselves." The assault on the tower broke after fierce fighting. Enemy forces withdrew, leaving behind casualties and abandoned equipment. "Tower secure," Rachel reported over command frequency. "Communications remain operational. All units maintain defensive positions." She checked her team for injuries, minor wounds from concrete fragments. Nothing serious. They'd held the position, maintained defensive integrity. But the battle wasn't over. Tactical displays showed hostile forces regrouping for one final desperate assault. "They're going to throw everything at us," Rachel told Bridgewater over secure comms. "One massive coordinated push to overwhelm our defenses. Can we hold?" Rachel studied the displays, calculating odds and resources. "Yes, because they're still planning for the Fort Redstone that existed 3 days ago. They're about to walk into kill zones they can't anticipate." She returned to the command center, uniform torn and dusty, minor cuts marking her face. But her eyes blazed with fierce determination as she prepared for the final coordination. The ultimate assault came 30 minutes later. Every remaining vehicle, every heavy weapon, every combat-capable fighter thrown into a massive coordinated attack designed to overwhelm through sheer firepower. It was exactly what Rachel had been waiting for. "All units prepare for final engagement," she ordered. "Enemy is committing all remaining forces. This is where we finish them. Hold your positions, trust your training." They're walking into a defensive arrangement built by someone who's been preparing for this exact moment for 3 years. The final wave crashed against Fort Redstone's defenses like a storm surge hitting a breakwater. Massive, violent, seemingly overwhelming. But the defensive positions held. The overlapping fields of fire created kill zones that channeled attacking forces into predetermined engagement areas. The redundant communication systems kept coordination intact even as equipment failed under sustained fire. Rachel directed the defense with commands that were crisp and precise. Her tactical awareness seemingly omniscient as she anticipated enemy movements and coordinated responses before threats fully developed. The battle reached its crescendo 90 minutes after the assault began. Enemy forces, battered by defensive fire they couldn't overcome, began a fighting withdrawal that turned into a rout. "All units cease fire," Rachel ordered. "Let them retreat. We've broken their assault capability. Pursuing would risk unnecessary casualties." The command frequency erupted in cheers as soldiers realized they'd not just survived, but decisively won. Final count: 31 wounded, 6 critical, 0 killed. Rachel stared at those numbers, emotions she'd kept controlled for 3 days finally breaking through. 0 killed. Every soldier who'd been on this base when she arrived was still alive. Emma's death had finally meant something beyond grief. "You did it, Rachel," Bridgewater said quietly. "You saved them all." "We saved them," Rachel replied, blinking back tears. "Every person who worked to implement those defensive improvements. This was a team victory." But she knew the truth. Without her expertise, Fort Redstone would have fallen. Soldiers would have died fighting bravely, but inadequately prepared. Just like Emma. The aftermath descended into organized chaos as medical teams worked on casualties. Rachel moved through it all in exhausted relief, checking on wounded personnel, coordinating post-battle security. She found Calloway supervising his squad's procedures, all four alive and relatively uninjured. "Sergeant Calloway," she said formally, "your squad performed exceptionally." Calloway turned to face her, his expression complicated, respect, gratitude, lingering questions about the deception. "Colonel Thorne," he replied, "we need to talk." They found a quiet corner away from the chaos. "I'm still angry about the deception," Calloway said. "You lied from the moment you arrived." "I know," Rachel replied quietly, "and I'm sorry for that. But I'm not sorry for the mission that required it." "Your sister died the same way we almost did," Calloway said. "This was personal." "Emma died because her commander was too proud to listen to better tactical advice," Rachel said. "I've spent 3 years making sure that never happens again. When intelligence indicated this base was targeted, I volunteered to come here undercover to ensure you didn't suffer Emma's fate." Calloway absorbed this. "I spent 15 years thinking I knew leadership. Then you showed up and demonstrated that real leadership isn't about years of service, it's about competence and giving a damn about the people you're responsible for." "You're a good leader, Marcus," Rachel said. "You just needed to trust that accepting help isn't weakness. That's what Emma tried to teach her commander." "He wouldn't listen. You did." Calloway extended his hand. "Thank you, Colonel, for saving my squad, for teaching me to be better, for honoring your sister by making sure her death meant something." Rachel shook his hand, feeling genuine respect in his grip. Hours later, Rachel stood before Fort Redstone's assembled personnel, every soldier who could walk wounded, being transported on stretchers, the entire base community united in survival. "3 days ago, I arrived here under false pretenses," she began. "I told you I was Private Rachel Thorne, a transfer with desk job experience. That was a lie. My actual rank is Colonel Strategic Operations Command. I was sent here undercover to assess defensive capabilities and prepare for the attack we just survived. For that deception, I apologize." She paused, letting the words resonate. "But I don't apologize for the mission that required it. 3 years ago, my sister, Lieutenant Emma Thorne, died in an attack on her forward base. She warned her commander about defensive vulnerabilities. He ignored her. 14 soldiers died because pride trumped competence." Rachel's voice strengthened. "I came here to make sure that never happened again. Today, you proved that preparation matters, that competent defensive planning saves lives. You didn't need me to be brave, you were already brave. What you needed was leadership that understood defensive warfare and cared enough to implement proper preparations." She scanned the faces watching her. "Every one of you contributed to this victory. This was a team effort in the truest sense, and I'm honored to have served alongside you." Rachel straightened to attention. "You are exceptional soldiers. Fort Redstone held today because of your competence, your courage, and your commitment to each other. That's the highest form of military excellence. Thank you for your service. Thank you for proving that proper preparation can overcome any odds." She saluted, holding it until every officer and NCO had returned it. The response wasn't immediate applause, it was something more profound. A wave of respect and understanding that spread through the assembled personnel. Tyler approached first. "Colonel, I sabotaged your radio when you first arrived because I felt threatened. That was petty. You saved my life despite it." "You saved your own life by being excellent when it mattered," Rachel corrected. "That's what counts." Connor was next. "My father was CIA. He died keeping secrets to protect people. I understand what you did and why. Thank you." "Your father would be proud of you," Rachel said sincerely. Hawkins approached last. "Remember I said I'd name my next daughter after someone important. My wife agreed. Emma Hawkins, born yesterday at 0600 hours. Thought you should know." This time Rachel couldn't stop the tears. She simply nodded, unable to speak past the emotion. The next morning, Rachel stood in the assembly area one final time, belongings packed, transport waiting. Calloway approached with his squad. "Colonel Thorne," he said formally, "Squad Bravo requests permission to present you with this." He handed her Tyler's modified tactical tablet, now programmed with defensive algorithms derived from Rachel's planning. "We documented your improvements, your protocols, your methodologies," Tyler explained. "Other bases might benefit from what you taught us, our contribution to Emma's legacy." Rachel felt tears threatening again. "This is exceptional work. Thank you." "We owe you our lives," Connor said simply. The goodbye stretched on soldiers, expressing gratitude, shaking her hand. Rachel received it all with as much grace as exhaustion allowed. Finally, she boarded the transport, looking back at Fort Redstone one last time. The base that had been vulnerable 3 days ago now stood as a model of proper defensive preparation. As the transport pulled away, Rachel closed her eyes and whispered, "I kept them safe, Em." just like you would have done. 2 weeks later, Rachel stood before Emma's grave at Arlington National Cemetery. The marble headstone bore her sister's name, rank, and the inscription, "She spoke truth to power." "I did it, Em," Rachel said quietly, placing Fort Redstone's unit commendation beside the headstone. "0 killed, 31 wounded, all recovered. Every single soldier you would have tried to save, I saved them." The wind carried leaves across the cemetery grounds. "Hartwick wants me to keep doing this. Undercover assessments at vulnerable bases. He says we can establish new standards, prevent what happened to you from happening to others." Rachel traced Emma's name on the stone. "I think you'd want me to say yes, not because it's about you anymore. It's about the next Emma, the next commander, too proud to listen, the next 14 soldiers who don't have to die because someone cared enough to fix the system." She stood military bearing, returning. "So I'm saying yes to the mission, to making sure your death saved more lives than just Fort Redstone." Rachel saluted. "Watch over me, Lieutenant. I've got work to do." As she walked away, Rachel didn't look back. Forward was the only direction that mattered. Emma would have approved. Epilogue, 6 months later. Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Syrian border. The contractor's briefing room smelled of dust and diesel fuel. Rachel sat among private security personnel. Her appearance transformed: longer hair, different mannerisms, a backstory about working logistics in Dubai. "Ms. Thorne," the base commander said, deliberately mispronouncing her cover name. "You'll handle supply chain coordination. Essential, but not exciting." Rachel nodded meekly, playing her role. That night, she sent encrypted messages to Hartwick. "Defensive assessment begins tomorrow. Same vulnerabilities as Emma's base. Same enemy force in region. Timeline imminent." Hartwick's reply: "Authorization confirmed. Do what you do best, Colonel. Bring them home alive." Rachel deleted the messages and pulled out a worn photograph, Emma's smile now accompanied by Fort Redstone's group photo. "Thank you, Colonel Thorne," written on the back. "2 bases saved, Em," she whispered. "How many more until we've balanced the scales?" Outside her window, she saw the base's southern perimeter: inadequate barriers, surveillance blind spots, generators poorly positioned. All the same mistakes. All about to be fixed by someone the soldiers would never suspect. Rachel Thorne smiled and began her assessment. The mission never ended, and she wouldn't have it any other way.